Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Code Your English, the channel that not only helping you to improve your English, but also helping you to grow and reach to high level of success in your life. My name is Jason, and today I am going to talk about how I became smart in my life. So let's dive in. When I was younger, nobody looked at me and thought, that kid is going somewhere. I wasn't the student who finished tests early while everyone else was still writing. I wasn't the one who raised his hand with the perfect answer, while the teacher smiled with pride. Honestly, for a long time, I believed I simply wasn't a smart person. The same way some people believe they aren't tall or aren't naturally athletic, as if intelligence was something you were either born with or you weren't. And I had clearly missed that particular gift when it was being given out. I carried that quiet belief with me for years, through school, through my first jobs, and even into the beginning of building this very channel, always feeling one step behind people who seem to understand things faster, remember things easier, and speak with a confidence I simply didn't have. So today, I want to tell you the real story of how that changed, not through some magical moment where I suddenly became brilliant, but through a slow, sometimes uncomfortable process of learning what intelligence actually is, and more importantly, learning that it was never something fixed in the first place. If you have ever sat in a meeting feeling like everyone else understood something you didn't, if you have ever compared yourself to a coworker, a classmate, or even a stranger online who seemed to just naturally get it while you were still struggling, I want you to know that this episode was written specifically with you in mind, because I have been exactly where you are. And what I discovered on the other side of that feeling is something I think could genuinely change how you see your own mind. By the time we reach the end of this episode, you are going to understand the real difference between people who seem naturally smart and people who actually become smart over time. And you are going to see clearly why that difference has almost nothing to do with talent. You will also walk away with specific daily habits, the exact ones I still use today, that quietly build intelligence in the background of your life, along with real English vocabulary and expressions you can use to talk about learning, growth, and personal development with genuine confidence. And near the end, just like always here on Code Your English, I am going to give you a short challenge that you can start using in your own life starting tomorrow morning. Something small enough to actually finish, but powerful enough to notice a real difference within a single week. The comparison trap we all fall into. I think most of us, at some point in our lives, have quietly compared our own mind to someone else's, and usually that comparison doesn't go very well for us, because we are comparing our messy, uncertain internal experience, all of our doubts and confusion and slow moments, to someone else's polished, confident outside appearance, the version of them we see in a classroom, in a meeting, or on a screen. This comparison creates a painful and completely false idea in our heads, the idea that some people were simply given a better brain, a faster brain, a more naturally intelligent brain, while the rest of us are left working twice as hard just to keep up. And I want to gently tell you today that this idea, as common as it feels, is almost entirely a myth. What made this even harder for me personally was learning English as a second language while also trying to build a career, because every small mistake felt like proof of that old belief. Evidence that I simply wasn't quick enough or smart enough to keep up with people who seemed to absorb new information effortlessly. I remember sitting in university lectures, translating sentences quietly in my head, while the professor had already moved 3 ideas ahead, and feeling a familiar, heavy frustration rise in my chest. A frustration that had very little to do with English itself, and everything to do with the story I was telling myself about what that struggle meant about my intelligence. This comparison trap doesn't only appear in classrooms either, And I think that's worth naming clearly, because it follows us quietly into offices, into online communities, and even into casual conversations with friends where someone mentions a book they read or a skill they picked up. And suddenly, we feel that small, familiar pinch of inadequacy without even understanding exactly why. What makes this trap especially unfair is that we almost never see the full picture of another person's journey. We only see the highlight, the finished product, the confident answer in the meeting, without ever witnessing the hundreds of quiet, unglamorous hours that person spent reading, failing, rewriting, and practicing long before we ever crossed paths with them. Comparing your unfinished chapter to someone else's finished one will almost always leave you feeling behind. Not because you actually are behind in any meaningful sense, but because you are comparing two completely different points in two completely different stories. What intelligence actually is, and what it isn't. Here is the idea that eventually changed everything for me, and I want you to really sit with this one, because once you truly understand it, you cannot easily go back to believing the old story. Intelligence, real, functional, useful intelligence, the kind that helps you solve problems, build a career, and understand the world around you, is not primarily about how fast your brain processes information in the first 30 seconds of hearing something new. It is much more accurately described as a collection of habits, patterns, and skills that anyone can build over time. Patterns like asking better questions, connecting new information to things you already know, staying curious instead of embarrassed when you don't understand something, and returning to difficult material again and again until it finally clicks into place. Researchers who study learning and cognitive development have spent decades exploring this exact question. And again, the evidence points in the same direction, that what looks like natural talent from the outside is, in the vast majority of cases, actually the visible result of thousands of small, invisible hours of practice, curiosity, and repeated exposure that happened long before anyone was watching. The person who answers questions quickly in a meeting today is very often the same person who spent years quietly reading, asking, failing, and trying again in private. And by the time you see them looking effortlessly smart in public, you are only seeing the final polished result of a very long, very ordinary process that simply happened out of view. This means the entire framework most of us grew up with, the idea that people are divided into two groups, the naturally smart and the naturally not smart, is fundamentally broken, and replacing it with a more accurate framework changes everything about how you approach learning, work, and even conversations in a language that isn't your first one. Instead of asking yourself, "Am I smart enough for this?" which is really an unanswerable and slightly unfair question, you can start asking a much more useful question instead. What specific habits would make me better at this, and am I willing to practice them consistently? The garden, not the rock. I want to give you an image that has genuinely stayed with me for years, because it completely reshaped how I think about my own mind. And I think it might do the same for you. Many of us unconsciously imagine our intelligence like a rock, a fixed, solid object that was formed a long time ago and simply is what it is, unchangeable no matter what we do with it, which means every difficult moment feels like proof of the rock's true size and shape, a permanent judgment on our worth and capability. But a far more accurate and honestly far kinder way to picture intelligence is as a garden rather than a rock, something living, something that responds directly to the attention, water, and care you give it over time, something that can grow in areas you invest in and stay small in areas you neglect, without any of that meaning, something permanent or shameful about who you fundamentally are. When you picture intelligence as a rock, Every mistake feels devastating because a scratch on a rock feels like damage to something that was supposed to be perfect and unchanging. But when you picture intelligence as a garden, mistakes become something completely different. They become simply part of the weather, part of the natural, expected process of growing something real, no more shameful than rain falling on a garden bed that is still developing its roots. I genuinely believe that this single shift in imagery, from rock to garden, from fixed object to living process, is one of the most powerful tools available for becoming smarter, because it changes your relationship with failure from something to fear into something to expect and even welcome as useful information. I remember hearing a mentor of mine describe this same idea in a slightly different way years ago, comparing intelligence to physical fitness rather than a garden, and I think both images actually work well together to make the point even clearer. Nobody expects to walk into a gym for the very first time and lift the heaviest weight in the room, and nobody watching a beginner struggle with a light weight on their first day would conclude that this person is simply permanently weak, incapable of ever building strength. We instinctively understand, when it comes to physical fitness, that strength is built gradually, through consistent, moderate effort applied over weeks and months, with soreness and difficulty along the way, treated as completely normal signs of progress rather than embarrassing evidence of weakness. Somehow, when it comes to our minds instead of our muscles, many of us quietly abandon that same generous, patient understanding, expecting ourselves to already be strong before we've even begun the process of training, and judging ourselves harshly the moment we discover we aren't. Let's pause here for a moment of real practice, because I don't want these ideas to stay only in your head as abstract theory. I want you to think of one specific area of your life right now where you have been quietly treating your ability as a fixed rock rather than a growing garden. Maybe it's your English-speaking confidence. Maybe it's a skill at work. Maybe it's something completely different. And I want you to say out loud, in English, a small sentence that reframes it as a garden instead. Something like, I am still growing my confidence in English conversations, rather than, I am simply not a confident English speaker. Notice the difference in how those two sentences feel in your body as you say them, because language itself, the words we choose about ourselves, quietly shapes what we believe is actually possible. The story that changed my own path. I want to share something a little more personal with you now, a specific memory that I think captures this entire idea better than any explanation could. Several years ago, before this channel existed in any form, I was working a job that required me to give presentations in English to international clients, and I remember one particular presentation that went badly, not because my ideas were weak, but because my English simply broke down under the pressure of the moment, and I stood there in front of a room of confused faces, completely unable to find the words I needed, while a colleague of mine, someone with what seemed like effortless fluency, calmly stepped in and rescued the moment for both of us. That night, I went home and made a decision that I now recognize as the true beginning of everything that followed, though it felt small and almost embarrassing at the time. Instead of deciding that I simply wasn't cut out for presentations in English, which would have been the easy, familiar story to believe, I decided to treat the entire failure as information rather than judgment. And I sat down and wrote out exactly what had gone wrong, which specific vocabulary I was missing, which specific moments made me freeze, and which specific phrases my confident colleague had used that I genuinely admired and wanted to learn myself. That single evening of honest, uncomfortable reflection became a habit I still practice today, treating every difficult moment not as proof of a fixed limitation, but as a very specific, very solvable list of things to learn next. Over the following months, I built small, consistent habits around that one uncomfortable evening, practicing difficult vocabulary out loud in the shower, recording myself explaining ideas, and listening back without judgment, and slowly, gradually, rebuilding a version of confidence that had almost nothing to do with sudden talent and almost everything to do with quiet, repeated effort that nobody else ever saw happening. I remember keeping a small, slightly embarrassing notebook during that period, filled with phrases I had heard my confident colleague use, expressions like, "Let me walk you through this," or "the way I see it," that seemed so simple once I saw them written down, yet had somehow never occurred to me in the pressure of a real presentation. And I would practice saying these phrases out loud, alone in my car on the drive home from work, long before I ever felt brave enough to use them in front of another person. There was one particular moment, about 4 months into this quiet, private practice, when I was asked to present again to a similar group of international clients. And I remember the distinct, almost surprising feeling of a phrase from that notebook arriving naturally in my mouth at exactly the right moment, without me having to search for it or translate it first. It wasn't a perfect presentation by any means. There were still pauses, still small mistakes, but something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time, a difficult moment in English didn't feel like proof of my limitations. It felt like exactly what it actually was, a normal, expected part of communicating in a second language. Nothing more dramatic than that. Looking back now, I can say honestly that the version of me who struggled through that failed presentation and the version of me making this video today are not actually different in terms of raw natural ability. They are different only in terms of the specific habits and patterns that were practiced consistently in between those two moments. And that realization is genuinely one of the most freeing things I have ever understood about my own mind. The daily habits that quietly build real intelligence. Let's talk now about the specific, practical habits that actually build this kind of intelligence over time, because understanding the theory is valuable, but it only becomes truly useful once it turns into daily action. The first habit, and honestly the most important one, is asking better questions rather than simply accepting confusion silently, because a smart approach to any new topic almost always begins with someone willing to say, out loud, or at least in their own mind, "I don't fully understand this part yet, and I want to know why," rather than quietly pretending to understand in order to avoid feeling embarrassed in front of others. The second habit involves deliberately connecting new information to something you already know well, because our minds remember and understand new ideas far more easily when they can attach themselves to existing knowledge, almost like a new branch growing from a tree that already has strong roots, rather than floating alone with nothing to hold on to. When I learn a new English expression now, for example, I actively try to connect it to a similar phrase I already know, or a specific memory or situation where I could imagine using it, because that simple act of connection makes the new information dramatically more likely to stay with me permanently, rather than disappearing within a day or two. The third habit is something researchers often call spaced repetition, though you don't need the technical term to use the idea effectively in your own life. And it simply means returning to information multiple times across several days or weeks, rather than trying to learn something completely in a single, intense session. Our brains are remarkably good at strengthening memories that get revisited over time, and remarkably quick at discarding information that was only encountered once and never returned to again, which is exactly why cramming for a test the night before rarely creates lasting understanding, while reviewing something briefly across several separate days creates knowledge that genuinely sticks. The fourth habit, and perhaps the most emotionally difficult one, is learning to treat mistakes as valuable data rather than personal failures, actively examining what went wrong with genuine curiosity instead of rushing to hide the mistake or feel ashamed of it. Every single person I have ever met who seems genuinely intelligent in a way that feels earned rather than simply lucky shares this exact trait, an almost unusual comfort with being wrong, because they have learned through experience that being wrong is not the opposite of being smart. It is actually one of the primary paths that leads toward it. There is a fifth habit worth mentioning here too, one that I discovered almost by accident through building this very channel, and it is the habit of explaining what you're learning to someone else, even if that person is imaginary, even if it's simply you talking quietly to yourself in a room, describing an idea out loud as though you were teaching it to a curious friend. Something genuinely interesting happens in our minds the moment we try to explain a concept to another person, because explanation forces us to organize scattered, half-formed understanding into something clear and structured. And very often, it is only in the middle of that explanation that we discover the exact spots where our own understanding was actually weaker than we assumed. This is part of the reason teachers so often say they learned a subject more deeply through teaching it than they ever did as students. And you don't need a classroom or an audience to use this same habit for yourself. You simply need the willingness to say new ideas out loud in your own words, regularly, as a normal part of how you learn anything new. Let's practice this idea together for a moment. I want you to think of a recent mistake you made, in English or in any other area of your life, something that felt uncomfortable or embarrassing when it happened. Now, instead of describing that moment with words like failure or stupid mistake, I want you to describe it out loud, in English, using more accurate, more useful language, something like, "That was valuable information about an area I still need to practice." Say that sentence now, replacing it with your own specific situation, and notice how much more useful and motivating that framing feels compared to the harsh, judgmental language most of us default to automatically. Becoming someone who learns instead of someone who knows. There is a subtle but powerful shift in identity that happens somewhere along this entire process. A shift from thinking of yourself as someone who either knows things or doesn't know things, toward thinking of yourself as someone who learns things continuously, as an ongoing identity rather than a finished state. This shift matters enormously, because when your identity is built around already knowing things, every gap in your knowledge feels like a threat to who you are, something to hide or defend against. But when your identity is built around the ongoing process of learning, every gap simply becomes the next interesting thing to explore, without any threat to your sense of self attached to it at all. I have noticed this shift very clearly in myself over the years, particularly in how differently I respond now when someone corrects my English or points out something I clearly misunderstood. Years ago, that kind of correction would have quietly stung, would have felt like evidence supporting that old, familiar belief that I simply wasn't smart enough. But today, the exact same correction feels almost exciting. Another small piece of useful information added to a collection that keeps growing larger and more interesting over time. And I genuinely believe that this emotional shift, more than any specific study technique, is the real engine behind becoming smarter across an entire lifetime. You can actually notice this identity in other people quite easily once you know what to look for, and I think it's worth training yourself to spot it, because it becomes a kind of quiet model you can learn from. Pay attention, in your next meeting, class, or conversation, to how different people respond when they encounter something they don't understand. or when someone gently disagrees with an idea they shared. Some people respond with a subtle defensiveness, a quick justification, a slight change in tone that reveals discomfort, because on some level, their identity feels attached to already being right. Others respond with open, genuine curiosity, leaning forward slightly, asking a clarifying question, sometimes even thanking the other person for pointing something out, because their identity is attached instead to the ongoing process of understanding more clearly. And that second group, almost without exception, are the people who continue growing long after everyone else has quietly stopped. This is also, honestly, something worth celebrating in yourself right now, in this very moment. If you are watching or listening to this episode in English, actively working to understand ideas about psychology, identity, and learning in a language that isn't your first one, you are already living proof of exactly the process we are describing, actively growing your own garden in real time. And that deserves genuine recognition rather than the quiet dismissal so many of us give ourselves without noticing. Your 7-Day Intelligence Challenge. I want to give you something practical to carry away from this episode, a structured 7-day experiment that puts everything we have discussed today into real, lived practice, because ideas without action tend to fade quickly, while ideas connected to specific daily behavior tend to genuinely change how we live. On the first day, your task is simply to notice throughout your entire day every single moment when you catch yourself thinking a fixed, rock-like thought about your own abilities. And instead of judging that thought, simply write it down somewhere, building your awareness of exactly how often this old pattern quietly shows up in your daily thinking. On the second day, take one of those fixed thoughts you noticed and rewrite it consciously using garden language instead, transforming something like, "I'm bad at public speaking," into something like, "I am still developing my public speaking skills, and I have specific areas I know I can improve." On the third day, deliberately ask one question out loud that you would normally have kept silently to yourself out of embarrassment, whether in a meeting, a class, a conversation with a friend, or even here in the comments of this very video, practicing the simple, brave act of admitting confusion instead of hiding it. On the fourth day, choose one small piece of information you learned recently, an English phrase, a fact, an idea from work, and deliberately connect it to something you already know well, writing down or saying out loud that specific connection so the new information has real roots to hold on to in your memory. On the fifth day, return briefly to something you learned earlier in the week, reviewing it for just a few minutes, practicing that habit of spaced repetition we discussed, giving your brain another gentle reminder that this particular piece of information matters and deserves to be kept. On the sixth day, deliberately choose to make a small mistake on purpose, attempting something slightly beyond your current comfort level. Whether that means speaking English with a stranger, trying a new skill, or simply asking a question you're not sure you'll sound intelligent asking, and then practicing, immediately afterward, describing that moment using the valuable, curious language we practiced earlier rather than harsh, judgmental language. And on the seventh day, take a few quiet minutes to reflect honestly on the entire week, noticing which day felt the most uncomfortable and which day felt the most surprisingly rewarding, because that specific combination of discomfort and reward is usually an excellent map pointing directly toward the areas where your own personal growth is most ready to happen next. I designed this particular challenge to move through a specific, deliberate sequence, starting with quiet, internal awareness on the first 2 days, moving into small acts of outward courage in the middle days, and finishing with the deeper habits of connection and reflection by the end of the week. Because real change rarely happens through one single dramatic decision. It happens far more reliably through this kind of gentle, layered progression, where each day quietly prepares the ground for the next one. If you find yourself skipping a day or feeling awkward attempting one of these tasks, please don't treat that as evidence that the challenge isn't working for you. Treat it instead as exactly the kind of valuable information we discussed earlier. Useful data about where your own personal growth is currently ready to happen and where it might need a little more patience first. Before we move into today's final question, let's briefly review some of the vocabulary we explored together in this episode, because using these words again, out loud, right now, is exactly how they move from something you merely recognize into something you can genuinely use. We talked about a fixed mindset, the belief that abilities are permanent and unchangeable, and we talked about its opposite, a growth mindset, the belief that abilities develop through effort and practice over time. We also talked about spaced repetition, the habit of reviewing information across multiple separate days rather than all at once, and we talked about reframing, the skill of consciously choosing more accurate, more useful language to describe a difficult experience. Try building one sentence right now, out loud, using any of these four expressions, connecting it honestly to something happening in your own life at this very moment. A question for you. I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below on this one, because this particular topic tends to bring out some of the most honest, most moving stories from this community, and I read every single one of them myself. I want you to think of one specific moment in your own life when you proved an old belief about your own intelligence wrong. A moment when you accomplished or understood something that the earlier version of you honestly didn't believe was possible. Write it down in the comments, in English, with as much specific detail as you're comfortable sharing, because I promise you that somewhere in this community, someone else reading your story today is quietly carrying the exact same old belief you once carried yourself, and your honest words might be exactly what helps them finally start rewriting it. Before we go, I want to leave you with one final, short thought before we close today's episode. Becoming smarter was never actually about becoming a different, more talented person than you currently are. It was always simply about becoming a slightly more consistent version of the person you already are. Someone willing to ask one more question, review one more idea, and forgive one more honest mistake along the way. In our next episode here on Code Your English, we are going to build directly on everything we discussed today by exploring exactly how to hold a natural, confident conversation about your own goals and personal growth in English, giving you the specific phrases and structures you need to talk about where you're headed in life without sounding stiff, memorized, or overly formal. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it when it arrives. I think often about that version of myself from the very beginning of this episode, the kid who quietly decided he simply wasn't a smart person, and I wish, more than almost anything, that I could sit down next to him now and tell him what I know today, that the quiet, ordinary version of intelligence he would eventually build had absolutely nothing to do with some missing gift he was waiting to discover, and everything to do with small, unglamorous habits. He hadn't learned yet, habits that were always, entirely, within his reach. I share that not because my particular story is unusual in any way, but because I suspect some version of that same kid, that same quiet belief, is sitting somewhere inside many of you listening right now. And if today's episode did nothing else, I hope it at least planted a small doubt in that old familiar story, a doubt worth following further. Thank you so much, genuinely, for spending this time with me today. If even one small idea in this episode gave you a new way of thinking about your own mind, I hope you'll carry it with you long after this video ends, into your next difficult moment, your next honest mistake, and your next small, quiet act of curiosity. Because the story we tell ourselves about our own intelligence shapes far more of our lives than most of us ever realize. And today, in whatever small way, you took one more step toward rewriting that story for yourself. Until next time, on Code Your English. Keep learning, keep listening, and keep growing. One honest conversation at a time.